So I'd like to start out by asking you, what important issues are underreported or ignored too often, whether they be economic or political?
Well, I mean, good news is no news, I guess. No? It's natural that, media tends to cover what's happening and what draws people's attention more than the real issues that have a long-term impact and are changing societies. But I think what people don't realize in the U.S. is how much Mexico has changed, and how Mexico-U.S. have been converging for a long time on a host of issues that I don't think people perceive. But because it's a long-term process and it happens little by little. And the other thing that is not covered, at least consciously, in the U.S. is how much the U.S. and Mexico are integrated. I remember 2 months ago, the Wall Street Journal had a long piece, front page, on the assassination of a mayor in the state of Nuevo León. It was all, the whole headline for the journal. And you start thinking about it. If the same thing happened in Spain or Argentina, in Córdoba or in Valencia or even in Rio in Brazil, would the Wall Street Journal carry that in the front page? I'm sure they wouldn't. And maybe not at all. The fact that it's Mexico makes it special for the U.S., but the American public do not make yet the connection as to why it's important to them. But it is. What I like to call the NAFTA convergence, Mexico-U.S. becoming more similar in many ways, I think is an underreported fact that people then will look back maybe 10 years from now and say, listen, I hadn't realized how much we look alike now, Mexico and the U.S. on many fronts.
Well, what would you say might be 3 or a handful of social or political issues that the observer or the investor should keep an eye on over the next 6 months?
We'll be approaching an election cycle in the U.S. and Mexico on 2012. In the U.S. there are elections this November that will change the political landscape in the U.S. In Mexico we had legislative elections in 2009, and people will be politically working towards 2012. And there will be a good deal of uncertainty as to who the next president of Mexico will be and who the next president of the U.S. will be. When we negotiated NAFTA almost 20 years ago, Mexicans knew who the next president was 6 months before election day, and now we know who the president of Mexico is, or the president of the U.S. is, 2 months after the election. So it's full NAFTA convergence.
Early next year, I believe, there'll be party leadership elections as well. I think all 3 major parties will be selecting candidates.
Yes.
So that also could be kind of a bruising battle, and in the context of 2012.
It only plays a role in the context of 2012. People will be joking for positions to see how the primaries will be run and who the candidates might be. But yes, there will be a lot of political activity. The thing to watch is whether Mexico we need, well, also in the U.S. by the way, significant reforms, because economics have changed. The challenges that we face in the international community are different than they were 3 years ago. So the country needs reforms to just keep up and be more competitive and make sure that we come out of the crisis growing. And, the same issues are faced in the U.S. in a different scale, but so the question is in the next few months whether we'll be able to pass some significant reforms before the presidential election really kicks in. There is a window of opportunity from November 15 to December 20th in Mexico, after the budget has passed on November 15th, and there will be an occasion with a lame duck Congress in the U.S. in the same time span. And then the other window of opportunity is between February and April, And if nothing gets done by May, then I don't think we'll see any significant reforms before 2013. So stakes are high, and the U.S. will be on the same timetable.
Yes, it is often said that the year before a presidential election in Mexico that little substantive political action can take place, since partisan activity,
It's more partisan.
especially in the last 20 years where
Yeah.
the elections have become more competitive.
It's more partisan, and then of course the president has little incentive to present new initiatives. And if he sent the bill to the Congress, I mean, Congress will not want to give him credit so that they may affect the election in 2012. But I mean, it's strikingly the resemblance between the political systems now. I mean, we have maybe too many checks and balances, and the difficulties of convincing the public that they need to participate in the political dialogue and force politicians to do the right thing.
Well, with that in mind, what key reform issues should President Calderon focus on? I know that labor reform is something that has been talked about for quite some time, and there is a government proposal on the table, if not actually being considered.
There's a PAN proposal.
Right. Okay, that's right, the party proposal.
Yeah, labor reform is important, but not crucial. I think in the next few months, the crucial reforms are the political reform and electoral reform. And then the other one is the tax bill, whether we could have a tax bill to reform Mexico's tax system. For different reasons. I mean, the electoral reform is important because we need a more robust system that can withstand competitive elections where the outcome is too close. I mean, you don't want to litigate every election because that leads to uncertainty and to difficulties, post-electoral difficulties that you can do maybe once in a generation. I mean, you don't want the Supreme Court deciding who the president is regularly. I mean, the election should be run in such a way that the outcome is accepted and settled on election night, not 2 months after the election. So to do that, the president has tabled a proposal to the Congress to change some of the electoral rules, and we'll see whether they can pass them between now and early spring 2011. The other one is the tax reform. Tax reform, the problem we have is that tax revenues are at the highest level in Mexican history, both in absolute and relative terms, in 2010. The Mexican government is collecting a lot more taxes than we used to. And the problem with that is that it's a reason to postpone any significant tax reform. But I mean, if we run out of oil, as we might need a different tax system in the years to come. But if you take into account the political calendar, if you don't pass something on 2011, on 2012 it's impossible. On 2013 you have a new president, a new Congress. We changed all of the members of the House. So you need to re-educate the new generation, the new congressional class. So it might take you the whole of 2013 to negotiate a tax bill. It will become in effect, in the best case, in 2014. And by 2014, oil might be a lot less than we have now.
You mentioned both political reform and electoral reform. Is the political reform has been close to movement in the past year, but it never really seems to get complete deliberation in Congress. Is there a chance that something may happen, say, next year in the spring session?
There is little chance.
Little chance.
Little chance because I mean the two basic components of those reform are one, re-election, and unfortunately the party leadership, not the party members, the party leadership has little incentive to do that because they derive their power from allocating and patronizing and allocating jobs to people. If there was re-election, their members of the House and the senators and mayors will owe their jobs to their electorates, not to the party bosses. So the party bosses will very unlikely vote against their own interests. And we don't have referendums, and as you have in California, for instance, to reverse something like that. So I mean, there will be pressure from the civil society into the political parties to allow for re-election, but it's difficult that it will pass. And the other one is the runoff elections. I mean, in Mexico we don't have a runoff, as many countries have. Not in the U.S., but in the U.S. you have the primary system and then the general election, which is sort of like a runoff. But the runoffs in Mexico would be very useful because it would make the electoral authorities less important in terms of deciding the electoral outcomes. Because if the elections are close, they go to a second round of voting, and in the second round the people decide who won, as opposed to the tribunals.
You mentioned the party leadership opposition to the political reform, and many people made the argument that party leadership kind of skewered the most recent electoral reform. Some people in the media here in Mexico described the outcome of that reform as creating a partyocracy, where the parties were the ones that kind of now are in control, and that further separated the constituency from actually being a part of the election process.
Yeah, the 2007 electoral reform is Exhibit A on the incentives that the parties don't have to make the system more a citizen-run system. And the best way to have a system that is run by citizens is actually to have having re-election, and second is to have runoffs. But I mean, of course, the parties are opposed because it's against their interests. So only a large movement by citizens will be able to change that. It will take time, but it will happen someday.
In connection with that, there's an ongoing selection process for 3 Federal Electoral Institute counselors. What should we look for with regard to that? And to put that in context, in 2003, when they had a prior selection process, I think a lot of people felt that 2 of the parties, the PAN and the PRI, kind of controlled that selection process, and the PRD was left out. And that
the PRD chose to be left out.
Right, they asked not to be.
So they
said this or nothing.
It was a strategic decision because they wanted to have the moral authority on election night to say the electoral authorities were biased against us because we didn't participate in their choosing.
That's what I was getting at, exactly. Because now it seems as though that a similar thing might be happening, where the PRI has mentioned, or has, behind the scenes, there are rumors that the PRI is trying to keep the PRD from having from selecting one of the 3 candidates.
Yeah, there are 2 differences though. One is that in 2003, they were selecting the 6 members, and now they are selecting only 3. So I mean, it doesn't lend itself to not as much as it did in the past. And the second issue is whether Mexico should go maybe the way the U.S. in allocating people in commissions, like in the Federal Trade Commission or the International Trade Commission in the U.S., along party lines. And I mean, in the U.S. generally you have bipartisan commissions, and you have 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and as opposed to 3 independent. So maybe, I mean, get away from people are not independent, and you just send representatives that have, you know, a reasonable counterweight to the others. But it's going to be a fight, and we'll see how that goes in the next few weeks.
All right,